So today we'll tackle the issue of systemic racism or structural racism. We have heard this word used more in the past several months than we probably have in the past 50 years. And it's a realization that we have systems in place in this country that keep certain groups down, keep certain groups from being able to progress economically, socially, health-wise, throughout our communities, throughout our society, based on systems, based on structures that have been put in place, policies that are put in place, sometimes without even realizing how racist they may be, without acknowledging that they have a racial component to them. And so today we'll talk about four areas. We'll talk about our criminal justice system, we'll talk about healthcare, we'll talk about education, and we'll talk about wealth and housing, and how those four major areas of our society have systemic racism, structural racism at the core, through history, through their concept, the construct of race, how that came to be and how that plays into everything that we do. Which is why you're starting to see and again hear this word so much, especially over the past several months, because there is this not only a realization, I think people knew that this was there, that this has been a part of our systems for 400 years, but there's an acceptance and a willingness to do something about it, and the responsibility. People are starting to feel the responsibility to take on the ownership for erasing systemic racism within our system. First, we'll focus on the education system. Within the United States, more than 35% of public school revenue comes from property taxes. This funding sounds feasible. Sure, but no. Funding by schools through these means there is more stabilization and favorability in funding for wealthier areas, which allows for those public schools to provide more extracurricular activities and resources to their students. Other local communities are forced to rely on strained state revenues for their funding. For example, the U.S. Government Accountability Office released a report that stated more than half of the nation's public school districts required an update or completely replace system like HVAC in their school buildings. The majority of these schools were located in high poverty areas. A result of these mediocre systems presents significant health concerns regarding poor air quality, which can in turn impact a student's academic performance. So we understand that education, or at least we've always been told that education is the stepping stone to change our socioeconomic status. That if we reach a certain level of education, if we obtain a college degree, then that's our ticket out. That is our ticket to home ownership. That is our ticket to economic wealth and generational success, breaking those generational curses that may be in some lower income communities. So let's take a look at the topic of wealth and housing and how systemic racism has impacted that over the years. In a 2007 survey of consumer finance, the median household income of a black family was $30,851, while in that same year, a white family was $51,418. Additionally, the median net worth of a black family was $17,100, whereas a white family was $163,101. Within the last 15 years, there's been a recession which has only increased the wealth gap due to people losing jobs and homes. Home ownership can completely change a person's economic situation by being able to conduct certain actions like offset healthcare costs and obtain loans. Today, the majority of renters are young people, single families, and people of color. We know that education is supposed to lead to better jobs, better paying jobs, which then should allow people to purchase homes. We know that home ownership is where most people obtain their wealth. We also know that the majority of people who are renting are low-income families, single-parent homes, and people of color. So if we look at and evaluate the systemic racism in our education system, and we know, again, that different schools, depending on your taxes, depending on your zip code, depending on the congressman or your state representatives or your local school district officials, funds are distributed disproportionately. We then know also that there's been systemic racism in home loans. We know that there's redlining. We know that folks of color are encouraged to live in certain parts of town and not shown homes in certain areas of town. And so if you look there, and then if people are not able to obtain success, not able to break those generational curses as a result of systemic racism, sometimes that leads to some issues of crime, that leads to some issues of survival, that leads to crimes that black folks, brown folks, and other marginalized people may commit and receive higher sentencing than those same crimes being committed by the majority culture. According to the United States Sentencing Commission, when a black person is arrested, they are approximately 20% more likely to be sentenced to jail time and be convicted with 20% longer sentences than those of their white counterparts, even though they were convicted of the same crime. The Sentencing Project affirms that African American adults are 5.9 times as likely to be incarcerated than whites, and Hispanics are 3.1 times as likely. In 2001, one of every 3 black males born in that year was expected to go to prison in their lifetime, while 1 in every 6 Hispanic males could expect a similar outcome. Only 1 in every 17 white males was thought to go to prison in their lifetime. In the United States, there's 2 distinct criminal justice systems. One that operates for those who are wealthy, and one that oppresses those who are from lower socioeconomic statuses and people of color. Former Georgetown law professor David Cole mentions in his book, No Equal Justice, the rhetoric of the criminal justice system sends the message that our society carefully protects everyone's constitutional rights, but in practice, the rules assure that law enforcement prerogatives will generally prevail over the rights of minorities and the poor. Our last area that we'll look at is healthcare. Healthcare has a long history of racism in this country, not necessarily based on just the color of your skin, but also your culture, the region of the world in which you are from, and your religious beliefs as well, and how all of those impact the healthcare that you desire to receive. We have lots of research for many diseases. We have government funding that goes into research for various types of cancer and other viruses and all sorts of things that plague the world. However, we note that viruses or diseases that are higher among African American and people of color receive much less funding. For example, sickle cell receives much less funding than that of other similar diseases that affect the majority cultures. We know that there are different types of cancers that affect people from black and brown populations at a much higher rate. There are different types of breast cancers that affect African American women at a different rate in which they affect white women. However, there's no test to diagnose this breast cancer at an early enough rate to increase the survival rate of African American women of this cancer. So many people will have many questions about why this is the case, and we could look back into history and understand how the history of our healthcare system came to be and how it intentionally shut out black and brown people and insurance and all sorts of things. So we'll take a little deeper look into our healthcare system and the underlying systemic racism that affects health outcomes. The American Academy of Family Physicians states that racism has been institutionalized in a way that allows the construction of procedures, practices, patterns, and policies that penalize and exploit people due to their race, culture, and ethnicity. This system of racism impacts individuals' beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, as well as the way these individuals act towards others and perceive themselves. While segregation and discrimination based on race is no longer legal today, organizations continue to discriminate based on insurance status. When we look at insurance, we know in this country our insurance is connected to our employment. We also know that systemic racism runs through many employment practices. We know that women in particular are paid less than men regardless of their race. We know that black and brown people make less than the majority culture even though they are doing the same positions. So when you think about how connected our healthcare is to our jobs, which are jobs jobs, and home ownership is often again connected to our wealth. You can see that all of this is intertwined, and we exist in a system intentionally and unintentionally is designed to create a gap between the majority culture and those who identify as marginalized populations. I encourage you to take some additional time and look at systemic racism and to understand it, and to understand that we all are a part of this system, and that no matter what job we have, no matter what neighborhood we live in, what school we attend, what hospital or doctors we visit, that systemic racism is real and it affects us all. And it continues to create a wealth gap, that recessions, that economic downturns, that changes in government policies don't allow people of color and from these marginalized populations to ever lessen that gap and to ever catch up with the majority culture. If you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to stop by my office located on the second floor of the Cromer Center. Thank you.